Mr. King for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's always my privilege and an honor to be recognized to address you here on the floor. And as often the case, I come here and hear the end of the debate that's gone on before me and feel compelled to address it from a bit of a different perspective. And as I listen to the gentlemen and the gentleladies talk about the right to vote, I think it'd be important for us to remind the body that there has to be a qualified voter. It isn't that everybody has the right to vote. You have to be old enough for one thing. You need to be an American citizen for another. And as I've watched things change over my adult lifetime, the integrity of the vote has been damaged. But the gentleman from Maryland made the statement that there's no evidence of any widespread voter fraud. No evidence of any widespread voter fraud. Well, I know that it's difficult to put this into the congressional record, Mr. Speaker, but I would hold this up for, let me just call this, evidence number one. This is an acorn. It's an acorn that I carry in my pocket every day. I carry it there every day to remind me of what that organization, ACORN, has done to the integrity of the vote in the United States of America. How much more widespread would you have to be than operations going on in nearly all, if not all, of the 50 states, the major cities, and millions of dollars spent to pay people to go out and fraudulently register voters? And there's over 400,000 fraudulent voter registrations that this ACORN symbolizes that they have admitted to going out and purchasing on a commission basis. We're going to pay you to get these fraudulent voter registrations. Oh, they can be legitimate, but they can also be fraudulent, and ACORN didn't differentiate between the two. They just paid out in commission. They violated the laws of the state of Nevada. They violated the laws of the state of New York, and this Congress shut down the funding to ACORN, and the national organization of ACORN collapsed. So for the gentleman to say, and I quote, there is no evidence of any widespread voter fraud, I think there's massive evidence of widespread voter registration fraud, and from that flowed fraudulent votes as well. We have watched the integrity of the voter registration and the election system be undermined over the last generation in almost a calculated way. Issue after issue has eroded the integrity of the qualified voter in these ways. Motor voter during the Clinton years. If you show up for a driver's license, and we know how well that works, how many of the, I think it's 15 of the 19 September 11th hijackers had driver's licenses that breeder document for false identification. You show up for a driver's license and they say to you in their native language, do you want to register to vote? And if you answer in the affirmative in any language, they put you down and register you to vote. People don't understand that they're bound by perjury laws. We don't know about the prosecutions that may or may not be taking place. It's not considered to be as serious an offense by, let me just say, the Department of Justice as it should be. After all, they have their prosecutorial discretion. They have testified before the Judiciary Committee where I serve that they select which laws they want to enforce and which ones they do not want to enforce. With regard to voting rights and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, we know how that works. They have a policy that has testified to under oath under several different scenarios that they will not move a voting rights case if it damages a minority. That's the policy of the Department of Justice, and it's the policy of the most recently departed Loretta King, who found that in Kinston, North Carolina, that voted like 70% of the communities in America to have nonpartisan local elections for mayor and city council, that they voted to abolish the partisanship and go to nonpartisan elections in Kinston, North Carolina. And so that would be a common practice. 70% of the cities and municipalities have done that. But in Kinston, North Carolina, they were forbidden by the Department of Justice because, if you read the Department of Justice's agent's letter on that, and that was Loretta King, that African Americans, no, she said blacks, wouldn't know who to vote for if they didn't have a D beside their name. Therefore, she forbid them from abolishing partisan elections in a city council and mayor race in Kinston, North Carolina. That's one example. There's another example of the intimidation that took place with the new Black Panthers of Philadelphia, standing out there, calling people crackers, smacking their billy clubs in their hand, taking an offensive posture in paramilitary uniforms. That's all on videotape. Most of America has seen that. And we saw what? This Justice Department was right off the case. The case was made. The convictions were there. This Justice Department canceled those convictions and released everyone except for the one individual, the most egregious violator, who got the tiniest little message. He got an injunction, don't do this again right here in this city, at least for the short term. That was the injunction. And Tom Perez testified under oath, and he's the assistant U.S. attorney, testified under oath that was the most severe penalty that they could have under law. Not true. Under oath, uttered words that were not true, and we should bring him back before the committee and call him to account for this. So Mr. Speaker, I want every American citizen who is qualified to vote. I don't want anybody slowed up at the polls and intimidated because of any reason. But to imply that there are people that are denied their right to vote in this country as if this were 1960 all over again really is a false premise to establish this on. We're all about legitimate voters, and I'm all against illegitimate voters that erode the vote and dilute the vote of the legitimate voters. I just mentioned motor voter. Absentee ballots themselves have been stretched out, and they can pass through numerous hands, and various states have different policies. And whenever a ballot goes from one hand to another hand to another hand, it opens up the opportunity for fraud. I can remember a case in Iowa where near the end of the election they found 444 ballots, absentee ballots, that had not been turned in yet, where'd they find them? Oh, Democrat campaign headquarters, 444 absentee ballots. And so, Mr. Speaker, there's an example of the election fraud. I would call it widespread voter fraud is taking place. There are convictions in Troy, New York, for example. I also listened to testimony before the Judiciary Committee by the Secretary of State of the state of New Mexico, who had to admit under oath that if I were working the election board, and I'm a resident of New Mexico in good standing and registered to vote, if I went in to work and figured that I would vote at the end of my shift, and somebody walked in and they said that they are Steve King, me, and they lived at my address, whatever it might happen to be in New Mexico, even if they alleged that they were me and I'm working the board, I can't challenge them by law in New Mexico. That's a law that encourages voter fraud. So what happens when they call up an hour before the polls close and they say, Sally, we know that you voted, but your husband Joe is registered to vote and he's not been in to vote yet. Can you send him down? And Sally says, well, no, Joe's in a truck in Maine. He isn't going to be voting. And 15 minutes later, somebody shows up and says, I'm Joe. And he votes as Joe. How do you catch that? How do you police that? I suggest you do so with a picture ID, a government-issued picture ID. We need to have a number of things go on. We have people voting on the rolls that dead people are voting. People are voting in New York and voting in Florida. That happened in the year 2000. We know about those cases. When you have fraud within the states, and that fraud flows over state lines, and when people get in buses and take a ride across the state line and go into the polls and they vote same-day registration and voting, it opens up the door again for fraud. And the people that want to game it and invest money in it are marginally winning those close elections. So this acorn that I carry in my pocket every day, it isn't because I have such an abiding dislike for acorn as an entity, but it's because I understand, and I want the American people to understand, what happens to the United States of America if the people that are perpetrating widespread voter fraud get their way. And it's this, Mr. Speaker. The Constitution of the United States is the foundation of this country. It's the foundation of our law. It is the supreme law of the land, coupled with federal law that's written within the guidelines of the United States Constitution. We often look at it if we hold on to the Constitution, because if we fail, our republic will fail and collapse as well. And I embrace the Constitution. I hold on to it, and I have one in my pocket every day, and I refer to it on a regular basis. But there's something underneath that Constitution. When you think of the edifice of a building, and you go down and you build a foundation on sand, for example, or a foundation on something unstable, no matter how good your foundation is, the Constitution, no matter how good that foundation is, if it's on unstable soil, it will collapse. No foundation can be sustained just by the strength of the foundation itself. And the underpinnings, the bedrock upon which this foundation of our republic called the Constitution sits, is free elections, honest elections, legitimate elections, elections where qualified voters, American citizens, go forth and redirect the destiny of the United States of America. But they have to be free elections, they have to be open elections, they have to be legitimate, they have to be fair. And we cannot have non-citizens voting. We cannot have fraudulent votes. We can't have dead people voting. We can't have transients that are not American citizens voting. If that happens, and it is happening, and if America loses confidence in the election system that we have, this bedrock that upholds our Constitution collapses. That bedrock of legitimate elections collapses. And if it does, the Constitution itself falls with it, Mr. Speaker. That's why it's important that we have voter registration laws that are voter registration lists that are free of duplicates. And where the states have laws prohibiting voting of felons, like Iowa, for example, free of felons, free of deceased, duplicates, and felons that require a picture ID. And we need to require that the Secretary of State certify that the registered voters are citizens. And we need to enforce it, and we need to police it. And we need to say to the Department of Justice and the Attorneys General within the states that have jurisdiction to bring these cases that you must set this as a high priority. Prosecutorial discretion when there's an assault on the bedrock that is the underpinning for the foundation of the United States, the Constitution. When that assault comes, it must be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. And this society and this culture and this Congress should rise up and demand that we have legitimate elections in this country. And when you think, Mr. Speaker, that a single state and a handful of votes, 537 votes in the state of Florida in the year 2000, determined the President of the United States may well have been for the next 8 years rather than the next 4 years. And each recount of those votes in Florida came back to the same or a very similar total. There's not a legitimate argument any longer that Al Gore really won that race. He did not. History cannot write that. Even the recount done by the Miami Herald comes back to George Bush winning marginally by very nearly the same number that the Secretary of State certified by 537 votes. But how many votes in Florida were fraudulent votes altogether? How much closer was that election because of election fraud? How many people voted in Florida that also voted in the state of New York? How many deceased voted? How many felons voted? We've got some records of those. And even though the felons of voting that we know of are not in great numbers, this could have come down to a handful of votes. This could have come down to one vote. And if a state doesn't have legitimate election process, and that state's electoral votes determine the President of the United States, and we would stand here and argue that we needed anybody that came into the polls should be allowed to vote, because if not, their vote might be disenfranchised, even though they took no responsibility to register themselves to vote, to go to the right polling place to vote, that they should be motor voted and same-day registration voted and walk into any precinct and voted, and that can all be sorted out after the fact. That happened in my state. My former Secretary of State, Chet Culver, who later became governor, amazingly, gave the order that anybody could vote in any precinct any time, and they would sort that out afterwards. And so the election that he presided over, where Iowa is the first in the nation caucus, we were the last in the nation to certify the vote. And he's the one that also supported an executive order to grant the felons the right to vote, even though the state statute specifically prohibited such a thing. And so I came here to talk about a different subject matter, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to endeavor to do that. But legitimate elections with integrity in our voter registration rolls, requiring citizens being devoid of duplicates, deceased, and felons where the law applies, and a picture ID, where the people that maybe can't figure out how to vote under the rules that every other citizen can meet, such as a picture ID, will pop out their picture ID to rent a movie, for example, or to get on an airplane as another example. They can have their picture ID, but they can't be bothered to show up with that when we're choosing, sometimes by a handful of votes, the next leader in the free world. Within the jurisdiction of the states, that if one single state has corrupt election process, even one that isn't clean as it can be, even one that's just sloppy, that illegitimate, illegal voters cancel out the votes of the legitimate voters, and thereby, by a marginal vote, like we saw in Florida perhaps, change the results in that state, and by doing so shift the electoral votes over to one side or the other for the presidency, and America gets a president that we really didn't vote for because we didn't have integrity in the voting process. And we could watch. It's not so much just the fraud, but if America loses confidence in the electoral system, if we don't have faith in the decisions of the American people emerge through the election process, then we lose confidence in our republic altogether, and that's when the United States, our Constitution, could collapse, Mr. Speaker. So this is a high and important goal that we have, and ACORN was cut off from federal funding by a massive outpouring of votes in the House and in the Senate. When they saw what was going on inside of ACORN, even some of the strongest left-wing Democrats that you sit over here voted to cut off the funding to ACORN. And I had introduced the first amendment to cut off ACORN about 4 years earlier. But I'm going to carry this in my pocket because they're reforming. They're reforming in localities and cities and in states all across this country again. Coming back, some of the same faces with a little bit different names. Down there organizing, by the way, in the Occupy Wall Street effort in New York. Should have known. You know, we could have played that, called that call shot early from the beginning. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to make a couple of comments in a transitional discussion here. I didn't set myself up with a segue, and I'll just jump right into it. And that is that I have the privilege to represent a good part of Iowa here in the United States Congress, and I've had the privilege to be involved in and engaged in the First of the Nation caucus process for quite a long time now. And it came about somewhat in this way, and that would be an Iowa legislature from years gone by decided to establish the First of the Nation caucus, and you know, a lot of the rest of the country didn't pay much attention to it, and it didn't attract the presidential candidates in the fashion that they would have envisioned early on. But in 1976, a little-known candidate and low-profile candidate for governor named a candidate for president who was a governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, came to Iowa. He saw that opportunity that the First of the Nation caucus provided, and Jimmy Carter spent a lot of time in Iowa. He traveled the state. He met people. He got to know people. He built a network, an organization, and friendships within the state. And by the time the caucus rolled around in 76, Jimmy Carter had won the caucus in Iowa, which was a surprise win. People didn't see it coming. The polling didn't show it. And that surprise win was a springboard that launched Jimmy Carter on to the nomination of the presidency out of this little-known First of the Nation caucus we have in Iowa. And the state law that was introduced says that we shall be the first competition in the nation, and it automatically moves the state of Iowa forward if any other state moves their date. And this year it will be on January 3rd. So it's earlier than usual, earlier than I would like, but it will be a significant competition that evening that will give the country the first look at what Iowa activists think about who should be the next president of the United States. I would take us back a little bit on history also. Something to reflect on, Mr. Speaker, and that would be this, that Jimmy Carter in 1976 won the nomination because of the springboard of the Iowa caucus. If he had lost the Iowa caucus, I don't think we would have heard of Jimmy Carter after that. His campaign very likely would have died. That was 1976. That was the year, by the way, that Ronald Reagan challenged unsuccessfully Gerald Ford for the nomination of the presidency. Well, 4 years later, in 1980, Ronald Reagan was a player in the Iowa caucus, but he didn't work Iowa very hard. George H.W. Bush did work Iowa very hard, and Bush won the caucus in Iowa. Reagan expected to, but he took Iowa for granted, and George Herbert Walker Bush won the caucus in Iowa in 1980, and then Ronald Reagan had the pressure on him when they went to New Hampshire. And there in New Hampshire, Ronald Reagan had the famous line, "I'm paying for this microphone," and he pulled the microphone forward. That was the shot that was the vignette that went around the country and around the world, and it exemplified the authority with which Ronald Reagan came to the debate, and the authority with which he had governed as governor of California, and the authority with which he would later on become the best president of the 20th century. But that moment in New Hampshire was a moment for Ronald Reagan that launched him out of New Hampshire and on to the nomination and on to the presidency. But if you'll remember, Mr. Speaker, Gerald Ford was under serious consideration for the nomination as Vice President of the United States, and I'm actually glad that they didn't make that decision. A former president as a Vice President would be too much friction, too much conflict, and not enough room for the new president to operate. But George Herbert Walker Bush was nominated and became the vice president under Ronald Reagan for 2 terms, 1980 through 1988, or 81 through 89 would be another way to describe that, and was, of course, the nominee and is elected to become the first president of the United States. So I would just speculate, Mr. Speaker, that had it not been for the Iowa caucus victory of George H.W. Bush, he very likely would not have been named vice presidential candidate, since he ran a competitive nomination competition against Ronald Reagan. Gerald Ford was not named vice president. George H.W. Bush was. He became vice president for 8 years and then president for 4 years. And would we have had a President George W. Bush if we'd never had Bush 41? We maybe would have never had Bush 43. So the continuum of history has shifted itself dramatically on the results of what was prior to that time, a very low profile, not very significant caucus in Iowa. Now, since that period of time, it's been leveraged up again and again and again. And in the last caucus, we saw what happened with Barack Obama emerging. His movement began in Iowa. Iowa gave him that launch to New Hampshire. And wasn't my choice, obviously, Mr. Speaker, but there's a legacy there that will play itself out again January 3rd of this year. I'm watching all the presidential candidates, and I'm watching how they perform and how they resonate with the voters. And I have said since, January, concluded that it was a slow start on the presidential race. And, most people weren't yet clamoring for a presidential race. I thought that it should be starting and we should start seeing more activity. So we did some things to initiate presidential activity in the state, including hosting a presidential event on March 26th at the Marriott Hotel in Des Moines, March 26th of this past spring. And that seemed to galvanize and launch this caucus process. And then a number of the presidential candidates came there and made their presentations. We intermixed it with good thinkers on policy issues of the day. That was one of the things that took place. But even then, as I listened to the presidential candidates, and as I have the privilege to talk with them and get to know them, and it is an extraordinary privilege to know these presidential candidates in this way. I like them all. I respect them all. Mr. Speaker, every one of them, in my opinion, would make a better president than the one we have. I'll have no hesitation about endorsing and campaigning for the eventual nominee. But there have been a couple of things missing. One of them is an economic policy plan. And as I listened to the candidates, they would talk about what they would repeal, but I wasn't hearing very much about what they would do on the proactive side. And so I even toyed with this idea, Mr. Speaker, and the idea of advancing some of those old repeals in my own way. But as I watch the presidential candidates, they want to tweak the tax policy some, and they all want to repeal Obamacare. I think that looks like plank number one in the platform of the nominee or any of the candidates as they compete for the nomination going forward. Plank number one, repeal Obamacare. Then they have their tax cut plans and how they would structure the taxes. But I have not seen all year long a significant economic proposal. And one of those that has emerged now that people can identify with is Herman Cain's 999 plan. Well, the 999 is a bumper sticker that does get people's attention. They can remember it. It's got a unique ring to it, and it causes them to pay attention and look into it and understand each of the three components. Well, there's a marketing brilliance in the 999 plan, and I'm going to try to avoid discussing the economic components of it, but there's a marketing brilliance. And then Mitt Romney had, prior to that, he rolled out his plan, a 59-point plan. And Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, I can't get through 59 points. What I can't memorize, I can't defend and explain. But subsequent to Herman Cain's 999 came then Rick Perry's 2020 plan. Let's see, cut and balance and grow, or pretty close to that anyway. I call it the 2020 plan. That also caught people's attention. To go to a flat tax. Steve Forbes is one of the advisors on this. It looks like R. Laffer is one of the advisors on Herman Cain's 999 plan. Both very respected economists. I'm one who goes for a fair tax, so it's hard to move me on these other policies. But we're starting to see now the presidential candidates differentiate themselves on their economic policies. But Mr. Speaker, what I bring this up for is this, that I'm looking at for a candidate for the presidency who can articulate a vision for America on what their view is, what their vision is, on how to take America to the next level of our destiny. What does America look like in a generation if they're able to bring their policies into play and lead with the bully pulpit of the presidency of the United States? What does America look like? What are fundamental principles that can be inspired by a president with that kind of vision? And how does that mesh in, how does that couple in with the policies that they would advocate? I take you back, Mr. Speaker, to Ronald Reagan again, who for his entire political career talked about America as the shining city on the hill. He didn't talk about the shining city on the hill that he promised we were necessarily going to have. He said, America is a shining city on a hill. And standing strong and true on a granite ridge. That's pretty close to a Reagan quote. It may not be exactly right, Mr. Speaker. But that gets you the concept. All of his political life, he had the vision for America as a shining city on the hill. He articulated it. When we heard it from him, maybe we didn't see it with the clarity that Reagan did, but we knew he saw it with clarity. That was the vision thing. That was what inspired America to come behind Ronald Reagan, and that's what inspired America to become, again, this resurgent nation where the malaise speech was put behind us and the imagination and the hope and the robust future for America unfolded from the Reagan administration. That's the biggest reasons why we see him as the greatest president of the 20th century. But the next president of the United States needs to articulate a vision, needs to tell us what America looks like, what are our foundational principles, how they will refurbish those pillars of American exceptionalism, how they can strengthen the measures of life and marriage, how they can strengthen the family, that basic building block of our civilization, how they can re-strengthen the constitutional understanding. I want to hear from a presidential candidate how they would make appointments to the Supreme Court of justices who will read and interpret the Constitution, the text of the Constitution, to mean what it was understood to mean at the time of ratification. We have a president who is intentionally nominating activists to the federal courts. It's a tragedy that those kind of judges would remove the understanding of the Constitution from the American people, and so far, we've kind of moved forward toward accepting the idea that the people in the black robes understand more about what's written and what is meant in this Constitution than the other people, that all of us in here took an oath to this Constitution. Our federal workers take an oath to this Constitution in the executive branch. Our troops all do the same thing. Many of our state officers do the same thing. You can't take an oath to a Constitution that's living and breathing. You can only take an oath to a Constitution that means what it says. And some of them take the oath and set about seeking to amend it, de facto amending the Constitution by redefining it. I want a president who understands the pillars of American exceptionalism, who can articulate them, who can transfer them into the future as the timeless values that have gotten us to the present. One who can articulate the great difficulty of moving to a balanced budget, how we get a balanced budget amendment that will guide this Congress so we can be bound by our obligation to our constituencies. One who has an understanding of foreign policy, one who has a full and complete tax plan that transforms America. All of those things are things that fit within the vision. And the vision right now is what I've tuned my ear for. And I'm hopeful, Mr. Speaker, that we'll be able to hear this vision come from the presidential candidates. And before we get into January, that we'll understand or hear with that clarity the next president with their shining city on the hill speech for us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.